7 o'clock, I hereby call to order this meeting of the Kenmore Planning Commission. First item on the agenda is citizen comment. Because we're holding a public hearing tonight, please do not render citizen comment relating to the subject of the public hearing, which is the proposed neighborhood business zone amendments. Please reserve those comments for the public hearing. But for all other comments, if you care to share them, please step forward to the podium on your right and state your name, your address, and try to limit your comments to 3 minutes.
No one has signed up to speak.
Nobody signed up for public comment. Therefore, we've satisfied the citizen comment element of the agenda. The next item on the agenda is approval of the July 18, 2017 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Do I hear a motion to approve or amend?
I move to approve the minutes.
Thank you. Do I hear a second? Second. Thank you. Amendments on the floor, or the motions on the floor. Any discussion? No discussion. All in favor of the amendment, raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All opposed, raise your hand and say nay. Are there any abstentions? The ayes have it. The motion carries. The minutes are approved. The next item on the agenda is the public hearing for the proposed neighborhood business zone amendments. I invite to the presentation table the city staff.
Good evening, Planning Commission. So tonight is the opportunity for a public hearing on proposed amendments to the neighbourhood business zone. You have looked at this issue over several meetings and held an open house. Tonight is a more formal public hearing. So to provide a summary of where you are with this discussion and your current thinking on the topic, Laurie's going to give a PowerPoint which will provide a good summary, and it will also be of benefit to those people in the audience with us tonight who are watching live online. So I think Laurie's all set to go, so I will turn it over to Laurie. Thank you.
Good evening. So as Debbie mentioned, this is kind of a recap of the recommendations. I've generalized, certainly not every aspect of the amendments that you've discussed are here, but this will give you a good overview of the neighborhood business zone proposal. So as you recall, the neighborhood business zone is in 2 places in the city. This map is small, but I think you can see the arrows. There's a 1 node of NB at Northeast 153rd Place and Juanita Drive, and the other one is at Northeast 170th Street and Juanita Drive. So existing uses at 153rd Place include it's at the moment a vacant restaurant space. It's a former automotive service business. Rocky's Corner, it's like a mini mart. The butcher shop, wholesaling operation and retail operation. And then there's a vacant property that is owned by the owner of the butcher shop. That's the site of a former gas station, and as we've mentioned previously, that's still under a cleanup order. At Northeast 170th Street, the Fortune Inn along Northeast 170th, there is a strip mall with, again, a mini mart operation and several other service businesses in it. There's a veterinary clinic. And then the Sunset Sunset Transmission, and I think they also do boat servicing there as well. So the Planning Commission has been considering the North Neighborhood Business Zone and the South Neighborhood Business Zone as being 2 sort of distinct areas. And in fact, the preliminary recommendation is that the North area at Northeast 170th Street become a sub-area of another zone called the Community Business Zone. And we're calling it tentatively the Community Business Juanita sub-area. The South NB area at Northeast 153rd Place, it would continue to be the neighborhood business zone, but with some modifications. So in the Juanita, community business Juanita sub-area, some of the newly prohibited uses would be outdoor arts and entertainment, a secure facility, that's like a jail, and standalone townhomes, the notion being that multifamily in this area would be part of mixed-use development. Some of the newly permitted uses would be a drinking place. The standard zoning code terminology is eating and drinking place. Currently, there's a footnote in the neighborhood business zone that says drinking place not allowed. So by putting eating and drinking place as a permitted use, this would, in fact, allow a drinking place. Educational service, all types. Previously, there were some that were not permitted. All types of retail sales. Again, there were some types that weren't previously permitted. And social assistance is no longer required to be in a surplus non-residential facility. There are none of those in that zoning district, so it didn't make a lot of sense. Some of the uses proposed to require a conditional use permit. So this would be a permit where the public would be notified and there would be an opportunity for public comment and the potential imposition of conditions. Ambulatory surgery center, indoor arts and entertainment, most of those. Automotive service, both marine and non-marine, and as we've discussed several times, automotive sales is currently a prohibited use and would continue to be a prohibited use unless it was an accessory use. Light manufacturing, and again, light manufacturing is distinguished from heavy manufacturing because it's more an artisanal manufacturing, like a bakery or a jewelry store, things that do not create traditional manufacturing issues for their neighbors. Also a vehicle refueling station, a gas station, or it's termed a vehicle refueling station because of the potential for electric vehicle fueling. Other changes, retail sales, personal service, educational service, and eating and drinking places would be limited in size to 5,000 square feet per use with a total of 15,000 square feet contiguous. And as we mentioned several meetings ago, the existing businesses conform to those standards, so there would be no impact on existing businesses, and it's to keep the fabric of the area small for some of these uses. In the neighborhood business zone, this again is at Northeast 153rd. Some of the prohibited uses, again, outdoor arts and entertainment, secure facility, standalone parking. This would be like a diamond parking lot. The newly permitted uses would include educational service, again, along with retail sales. In current standards, there are some of those uses that are prohibited. Now they all would be permitted. And then some of the uses proposed for a conditional use permit. Indoor arts and entertainment, again, automotive service, and light manufacturing. And that same restriction on size of a business, 5,000 square feet per use with a total of 15,000 square feet contiguous. Development standards, things like setbacks, heights, etc. In the Juanita sub-area, some of the modifications would be to increase the residential density. Currently, it's 8 is the base, 8 dwelling units per acre is the base density. You can go to 12 dwelling units per acre if you meet certain affordability criteria. It's a section of the code that hasn't previously been used. Or if you provide parks, you can also do that increase. The increase would be to 24 to 36 dwelling units per acre, comparable to the community business zone, which runs along Northeast 181st Street. Street setbacks would be reduced. The proposed amendments would also eliminate the opportunity to go up to 75 feet in height with additional setbacks. Would apply new design standards, again comparable to the community business zone, to encourage a pedestrian orientation, and would increase the maximum floor area of residential from 50% to 75%. In the neighborhood business zone, again that's the South NB, again an increase in density is proposed but not as high because we're trying to mimic to some degree the neighboring properties which are zoned for multifamily at ranges from 12 to 18 dwelling units per acre. Again, the elimination of the opportunity to go to 75 feet and using height and building form rather than floor area ratio to control the size of buildings. The project also involves some comprehensive plan amendments, very minor at this point, because the land use map would have to be revised. The densities that have been talked about would have to be reflected in the comprehensive plan, and descriptions of the districts would be refined. The one issue that the Planning Commission has provided, has discussed but has not really provided a recommendation on is affordable housing. This was a presentation that Arthur Sullivan gave at your last meeting, and two possible approaches were discussed. One would be to have a mandatory requirement for affordable housing, which would be to increase the density to the maximum and then require that 10% of new units be affordable. The other option would be optional, in which case the base density would remain the same or something comparable to that. And if you wanted to go to a higher residential density, then you would have to provide a certain number of affordable units above the base density. So those were directions that were discussed, no conclusions reached. In the draft proposal, moderate income units would be provided, but the number could be reduced if low income units were provided instead. And there was an option to do a fee in lieu payment for partial units. So hopefully that's a quick refresher. And unless you have questions, that's all I had to present.
Thank you. All right, with that, I'd like to open the floor to the public hearing. Do we have a sign-in sheet?
Yes.
Yes,
Billy
yes.
is first on the list.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, the name again was? Thank you.
So you can.
Okay, so
Name, address?
Billy Stone, Wu Stone, 15012 Juanita Drive Northeast.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Name in the business, Rocky's Corner. So I have a couple of questions, but to start off, I want to say that I don't see any, okay, from when I first talked to you guys, you said that it was a rezoning and you guys were condensing the zoning laws from 200 down to about 50, but that does not seem to be the case to me. And you say that the City Council, the Planning Committee, they all say that this could benefit, but all I see are things that hurt all the businesses in there already. You guys say that all these good things are happening, but all I see is you taking things away. The only thing I see that's different is the MDU difference in the density. And to me, that says that you guys are trying to push out the small businesses and try to build in, high-rise buildings. 6-story buildings to try to increase property values. I don't know what, but I'm not very happy about this whole situation because it just seems like you're trying to screw all the small businesses. So I don't know all the details, so I'm still reading all I can about the zoning laws, but I don't also see why it's being treated differently between the 170 something location and the 153rd Street location. I mean, they have fairly similar businesses, fairly similar uses, and basically the guy sitting next to me sounds like he's going to get screwed pretty hard. So I'm just wondering, well, if he's going to get screwed, then who else is going to get screwed beneath the layers of all this mumbo-jumbo? So I don't know how many more meetings there are about this, but it's nothing that comes out of this except for possibly the MDU change seems good in my opinion. If Kenmore wanted to do things correctly and they wanted to raise property values, they could have put in McMenamins a couple years ago. We all see what happened to Bothell, and there's no person in this room, you have to be stupid to think that that was bad for Bothell. All the property prices went through the roof. It increased, just everything about the situation was done correctly. And so I know there are a lot of residents in this area that are against, for instance, the St. Edwards thing. I know that a lot of people are against anything going in there. But there comes a time where it's like, well, you got to do something or, you're not going to save it. So I'm still trying to figure out what's going on here because I don't even fully understand what you guys are trying to do. It doesn't seem just a condensing of 50 from 200 to 50 zones, though. In my opinion, it is a little bit on the targeted sides because there are only 2 small zones that are in this neighborhood business zone, and in my opinion, I think that somebody out there wanted to come up with an idea to try to get the local eyesore of cars being parked out along in a lot and try to get rid of that. Because before, the car sales and use or whatever, that was okay, and you guys want to take that away. And I don't really understand why, but 2 businesses out of the zones are going to get screwed. And it's not my business, but I still care, because they've been there for a long time, so. That's pretty much all I have to say for now, until I learn more.
Thanks, Billy. Next name on the list, and forgive me for not getting this pronounced correctly, I think Edmund? Yes. Tamrazi? Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Edmund Tamrazi. I'm the business owner of the Sunset Transmission and Sunset Fiberglass, and we have a small car dealer. We sell some few cars over there. Anyway, the zoning is going to change, and they say we have to get the permitted conditioner license, or we don't know what's going to happen, because really our businesses is not that big. We make, for example, the boat business. We do fix a few boats a year. Boat businesses, they're nice, about almost 50 some years over there. Over there have the auto sale and the transmission shop almost 20 some years, 24 years. Actually, I'm there. But I'm wondering what's going to happen, what we have to do the next. If they close our businesses, what we have to do? What's our option in the future? Is mean we have to make a building the place, or we have to sell it and go, or I don't know, city gonna buy it from us? What's our option in the future? We have to know what we have to do, because we have family to feed, and we have some other employee. They work with us. They have to have some money to feed them family. And anyway, but I think the city, they try to give us a permitted zone. It means conditioner permitted zoning. And I don't know what's going to be, what's going to happen, and how conditioner they're going to give it to us, what we have to do over there. And that's the only thing I'm asking, what's our in the future. We have to, explain to us what we're going to do in the future over there. And the car business right now, actually, we're not selling that many cars, maybe a few cars a month. Even the transmission shop, we're not that busy. The boat business, the same thing. All those businesses just generate a little bit of money to we survive. That's the thing, I want to, know what's going to happen in the future, and that little location actually is mean we're going to leave or we're going to stay there. Thank you so much. Thank you, Edmund.
Okay, anybody else? No. I'll let you do it. We do have a...
Okay, so the biggest issue, the reason I came down today was because
Hey,
a few years back...
Billy, I can hear you real well. In fact, You're a little loud.
All right.
So you could either turn off the mic or maybe talk more softly.
Cool.
Thank you.
So the reason I'm down here is because years ago, about 3 years ago, I had a major issue with Kenmore City Hall with... you guys basically tried to come after us because we cleaned out a drainage ditch, which was somehow classified as a stream, and tried to fine us like $20,000, $30,000, tried to hire an ecologist. And so we had to go through about a year of running around, and there was a guy that was out to get us. And basically he got taken off of our case. And specifically an Asian guy came on our case to try to make sure that we didn't sue the city. But I have fears that something very similar is happening right now, and that I don't fully understand what's going on. Basically, I've had one time where the city came after us for no reason. And anyone from here, this room, could have come out there and seen it was a ditch, a drainage ditch. I mean, anyone could tell. It's not a protected stream. Salmon don't swim up it. And so I already, under the assumption, as soon as I got that letter the first time at the beginning of June, before that first meeting, I was under the assumption that we were going to get screwed somehow. And it's just the wording on it maybe wasn't done well, but I just don't see anything good coming from this. I mean, why are so many things being taken away and there's no benefits? Why would I want to say okay to
Okay,
something
Billy,
where I just get
you're
something
kind of going
wrong?
over what you said before, so
Okay.
I think I got
So
that point.
my
If you
whole
want to add
point is-
something, hey,
is
Billy,
that-
Billy, I'm running this meeting, okay? So I'm going to tell you when you can start, when you can stop.
Or
I'm giving, Billy,
you can not be such a dick, seriously.
Billy, you're done, okay? So we're going to, you're done. So we're done with the public hearing from you, and we'll see if there's anybody else who wants to talk. It doesn't look that way.
All right, well, if that's the way that you
Billy,
if
Billy,
that's the way you want to play it,
We're not going to deal
Okay,
with obscenities
okay, then
here.
I will-
You've
I
had
will
your
get the
chance.
people
You've
behind
had
me.
more than your chance.
okay, we'll see what happens.
Okay. So there being no one else in the council chambers, I don't think there's anybody else on the sign-in sheet. In fact, I'm sure of it. That concludes the public hearing portion of this meeting. All right. So now it's to the Planning Commission to deliberate over the proposals regarding the rezone. Before we do that, we did have some questions that came up. I think there's a misunderstanding of the principles of grandfathering, perhaps, as to who's getting pushed out.
That's not the issue.
And you know what? I'm going to ask you to leave this room if you keep interrupting us. So if we could talk about a little bit about the principles of grandfathering and perhaps the purpose behind this rezone, that might be helpful.
Okay, so I think I'll start with kind of the purpose behind the rezone. So the neighborhood business zone is the last holdovers commercial zone from King County. So when the city incorporated in 1998, they adopted what was the county's zoning for this area. And so the city council, having looked at every other commercial zoning district in the city, asked the planning commission to take a look at the zoning and to refresh it and update it based on the city's comprehensive plan and current perspectives. So I think there's some confusion between what is going on with the neighborhood business zone and what is going on with another separate project. And I think I want to mention this because there was a question about, well, why did 200 uses that are permitted suddenly become 50 uses? So when the city council looked at the regional business zone, which runs along SR 522, at the same time, and the Planning Commission reviewed that as well, there were a whole bunch. There were about 200 different land uses defined. And they created a new set of standardized land uses that incorporated all of those other land uses, but provided new definitions, and it was an attempt to streamline the code so that every single zone uses the same uses. That project has been in front of the City Council. The City Council adopted that about a month ago, 3 weeks ago maybe. And so what that did was to make all the uses consistent across all the zoning districts. And that was the conversion from 200 uses to 50 uses. And the Planning Commission has not been involved in that project. But the neighborhood business zone picked up those standardized uses, knowing that this other project was going on. So that's the background for that.
Can we elaborate on that? And I just want to interject something here.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that that a lot of the uses are more broadly defined, and they make reference to NAICS, which is an index that helps further define those uses.
Correct.
So it doesn't just reducing the number of permitted uses doesn't mean the scope of the permitted uses
Right.
has been changed.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, so other clarifications, actually the maximum height limit is for both areas is being proposed to be reduced so that it would not be 6 stories, but would go from 75 feet down to 35 or 45 feet,
Right.
depending on the area.
Right.
And then maybe a little bit about the rationale for why the 2 areas were treated differently. I think the Planning Commission's perspective was that the area around Northeast 170th Street is really within walking distance of downtown. And like the area along Northeast 181st Street, there was a focus on that more pedestrian orientation and the connection, the supporting connection to downtown. So that's where the decision to treat the north different from the south came from. As far as Mr. Tomrazi's questions about what the conditional use permit would mean, Mr. Tomrazi's automotive service business would continue to be a conditionally permitted use. That actually doesn't mean that it becomes nonconforming as to use. So he does not become a nonconforming use. His use is nonconforming as to process. And what that means is that if he ever wanted to expand, he wanted to make his building bigger or something like that, he would have to get a permit to do that. The neighbors would be notified, and there'd be discussion of things like screening, impact, etc. But if he were to remain in his existing building, continuing to do automotive service, even if he sold his building to another person who wanted to do automotive service and the building was the same size, it would make no difference. There is no impact. And there is nothing that he would have to do for his current existing businesses to continue.
He doesn't have to satisfy the conditions.
No.
So if nothing changes, or if you just sell it and it continues in the current use, you don't have to take any extra steps or expend any more money.
Right.
So you're not getting pushed out.
Right. The automotive sales continues to be a separate discussion, but
Right.
we've already talked about
Right, and we talked about that last meeting.
it. Yeah.
All right. Are you comfortable with that? Okay. And I just want to talk, too, about grandfathering generally. I mentioned that before, but some people think, oh, they're proposing changes to the zoning code for our area. The principle of grandfathering means that those who are currently operating, and if their use is changed to non-permitted, can continue operating, just as they always have, just as we've discussed about your business, Mr. Tomrazzi. So nobody's getting pushed out. It's only if they change their use or they stop the use for a material period of time and then they seek to reuse it. Then they'd either have to satisfy the new conditions. If it's prohibited, then they couldn't. But it's in their control as long as they're currently using that property the way they have under the previously permitted use. And that's what the word grandfathering means. If you were back doing the kind of use before the change was made, you can continue doing it as long as you want. And that's true for all the businesses in both the areas that we're talking about rezoning here. All right, so that brings us to the end of the public hearing portion of tonight's meeting, and now it's the deliberation portion. So I think we have before us, if anybody wants to take up a particular subject about those proposed items, let's do so, and I invite any questions. None? Vice Chair.
Maybe just a clarification. Could you refresh my memory? I know this came up earlier about, this is maybe more for the affordable housing component, why we are doing this now before the broader look at affordable housing. I know that came up earlier, and I know you explained it, but could you at least refresh my memory, perhaps? Others
Sure.
don't need that, but I do.
So the way affordable housing requirements, whether they're optional and you can choose to do them, or whether they're mandatory, the way that works is that you have an opportunity to do that when you're increasing densities. So that actually the property owner is getting a benefit. They're getting the ability to do more of a development, to have more units, that kind of thing. And in exchange, that's the time to consider whether or not an affordable housing requirement of some sort should be applied. If we wanted to wait until we take the broader look at affordable housing, that's something that could be done. But at that point, staff would recommend that you not increase the densities in these areas, because once you've increased the densities, you've given up your opportunity to apply an affordable housing standard. You can't go back after the fact and reimpose an affordable housing requirement.
Yes, Vice
And just
Chair.
to follow up, so whatever we would do or not do for affordable housing, again, would apply only to this particular zone. It wouldn't have any sort of precedent for any other zone.
No. No.
Those would be addressed entirely separately.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody else? So I think the most efficient way, oh, go ahead, Commissioner Baker.
I just have a question. I know that at our last meeting, Arthur was posed with a few questions, and I didn't really see where his answers were.
Yeah.
Could you help me find?
I have the answers.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm so glad you brought that up.
Okay.
I don't have I have written answers, but I don't have them written to hand to you. There were two questions that I asked Arthur after your last meeting. One question was, and I'll just read you the question, and then I'll read you Arthur's response. Arthur was not able to be here tonight. Why in the voluntary approach to affordable housing, where if you go above the base, then for the extra units you provide affordable housing. Why in the voluntary approach was 1 unit in 4 chosen for the affordability requirement? I think Commissioner Orenshaw maybe asked that question, like why 1 in 4? Where did that number come from? So Arthur's response, that ratio is based on offsetting the cost to the developer of providing affordable units to the value of the additional density. So it's a ratio between the cost of providing the unit and the value of having the greater amount of density. And then he mentions that the chart in the PowerPoint that he showed last week shows the math of calculating the cost to the developer and how the 1-to-4 ratio results in offsetting that cost. So it was a balancing act between those two factors, is why 1 in 4 was chosen.
Okay.
The second question was it was about a section under alternative compliance, and there was a concern that there was a phrase in there that said that you had to provide the housing if it was in a different area within a certain time unless otherwise approved by the city. And there was, you went back and forth over that. I think, that there was comments that provided more flexibility than trying to tighten up the language. Arthur wanted to point out is that the following sentence after that comment about unless otherwise approved by the city, there's a requirement, both the sending site, so this is the one that's sending the affordable housing units elsewhere, and the receiving site, which is where the affordable units are actually going to be located, have to sign a covenant until the affordable housing is created on the receiving site. So that certainly tightens up that requirement. If both properties have then a recorded legal covenant that says this is the way this transfer is going to happen. So he wanted to point that out.
So that was the timing issue.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Commissioner Vanderline.
Just want to follow up a little bit on Commissioner Orenthal's earlier question. I really appreciate all the information we've gathered here related to affordable housing, but it does continue to come into my mind, is this a good opportunity to be discussing affordable housing when we're doing it outside of a comprehensive look across the entire city? We've never really had, at least in my mind, a good answer to the question of what is our current affordable housing capacity, what is our goal, how would that look, in terms of all of the rezoning work we've already done. So there's part of me that ideally don't want to lose the work we've done already, but I'm afraid we might be putting ourselves in a situation of unintended consequences or making decisions we might regret later when we do a more comprehensive look at affordable housing over the entire city.
And I do think that is a question that came up when we looked at affordable housing. This was actually when we were doing the comprehensive plan, and we asked the question, for a city our size, how much affordable housing do we currently have available, and what are the intended goals that the city wants to reach, or is there a standard measurement that King County would like a city to reach? And we didn't talk about those issues when we were reviewing affordable housing for these, looking at these rezones. But that is a question that I think does encompass more of the general idea of affordable housing in Kenmore. And it is hard to just pick something when isn't attached to the overall goal that the city might have.
Anybody else?
Even though it's an opportune time to talk about it, it's like, how does it fit in with the big picture?
Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
Commissioner?
I just add one other comment onto that. I do recognize, and I think we all recognize, we have a housing crisis in our region. I think there's a question about what is Kenmore's responsibility to help alleviate that. I just have a hard time dealing with this question outside of the larger consequences or context, particularly when I'm not sure that there really is an impending crisis that makes this something that we need to deal with immediately and not allowing ourselves to have the time for a more thoughtful discussion and some more thoughtful work on this.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, Commissioner Mulcair.
So, to Mike's point, if we took that approach and deferred an affordable housing strategy as relative to these zones, what's the process, I'm asking or wondering, to retrofit that in? Is it truly a missed opportunity where if we don't build it into the current zoning considerations, it will be more difficult to implement them later?
Well, it depends. If you, for example, went from 8 dwelling units per acre, which is the base currently, and you went to the maximum density, you would have lost the opportunity. You cannot go back and retrofit and apply affordable housing requirements in that way. It can only be as a trade-off between the increase in density and then the affordable housing requirement. So another strategy would be, and we're balancing a couple things here. So staff was interested in and recommending to the Planning Commission that densities be increased for different reasons. One, because I think we've talked about the importance of providing housing and the opportunity for more housing as a way to ease the housing crunch, regardless of affordability. But also because, for example, the location at Northeast 170th Street is an area supportive of downtown, close to downtown. It seems like an ideal area for increased density, and 8 dwelling units per acre is almost a single family density. So staff initially went into it proposing increased densities for reasons other than affordable housing. But as Arthur pointed out, whenever you're in the position of increasing density, you have to ask this question because you can't go back. So if the Commission wanted to defer the discussion of affordable housing to a citywide look at the topic and where and how much, et cetera, then there would be 2 paths forward for neighborhood business. One would be that you would leave the density where it is now, 8 to 12, and then at the time you did a citywide review, you would say, is it appropriate here? Is it not appropriate here? Shall we increase densities here and take an affordable housing approach? Or you could increase the densities somewhat and still leave some wiggle room for where you might ultimately want the density to be and take that up at the time of the citywide review. Or you can say, we're not interested in affordable housing at these locations. They're small areas, and therefore we are just going to increase the density, hoping that that will provide more dwelling units in areas that we think are appropriate, but affordable housing will not be a topic for these areas. Unless, in the future, I suppose you could talk about a TOD at Northeast 170th, and if you did that, that would be another density increase, and then the question would come up again. So I hope that clarified.
Yeah, that's helpful. Commissioner?
Yes, thank you. That was very helpful. Question, is affordable housing on the future Kenmore Planning Commission agenda, or is the council planning on taking this up?
It is on the future Planning Commission agenda, but it's not for this year. This year, the top priority was means and techniques to preserve existing affordable housing. So that was the item that was coming forward to the Planning Commission this year. It's possible that that component of the housing strategy plan could come forward next year, but I will tell you that next year we are anticipating a very busy docket having to do with critical area regulations and potential shoreline master program updates. So that will be a significant, those of you who have been through it before.
The shoreline is back.
I know. State mandate. June 2019.
We were. But it keeps, it's like the update process.
So yes, it's targeted to come back, but it may not be for a while.
Yeah, Vice Chair.
I just wanted to have a clarifying question. Laura, you mentioned you can't retrofit and apply requirements. Does that mean for the mandatory as well as the voluntary incentive approach? Could you still do an incentive approach with at some future point, or?
I would have to
increase
ask
the density-
Arthur specifically that question, but it was my understanding that even though it's an optional approach, if you take the optional approach, then you have to provide the affordable housing. And it was my understanding that it always had to be in conjunction with the density
Any kind of affordable housing
increase.
Okay.
Right.
So, go ahead, Commissioner.
My comment
Donald.
would be that it's not a bad idea to experiment. It could be the first, step and maybe applicable in the future for other areas. So I'm not afraid of doing this on these two small parcels. But if we don't do the affordable housing with this, then I think we should keep the density at the same it is now, because you can't, there's a motivation for people to do the affordable housing with the increased density, and they're not having a loss. There's no taking from the landowner.
Thank you. I wanted to add something, and it's really picking up mostly on what Commissioner Vanderline brought up. And it's not so much whether this is the right time, but there's a sense when I hear people talking about affordable housing and having affordable housing incentives or requirements that the density increase is divorced from that. And I know that Planner Anderson talked about how increasing density is a part of the economic question of how to make housing affordable. That, when we talked about how to rezone these two areas, that was my goal when I suggested or participated in our discussion about whether we increase density. Here's what I'm getting at. We've already gone through a pretty thorough analysis of housing and affordable housing as it was on our docket last year. It was our primary subject. We came to agreement on some of the principles that we think address that issue. In our presentation to the City Council, we talked about two primary ways that have worked efficiently and are agreed upon widely by economists in making housing more affordable. Density, because you have limited land and you got to have more units, and there's virtually no dispute that inventory or lack of housing inventory is the key problem with rising housing prices, not just in our area, but throughout the country. And in fact, coastal California is probably the prime example of this. It's probably the most expensive housing region in the country, and they've regulated very heavily. They've been very active about it, and it's made it worse because it has created a lot of land use restrictions. It's created a lot of tenant protections, which dissuade investors from building in those areas when they could build elsewhere. And there's, I think, a third element. The permit process is very cumbersome in those places. So it's been addressed by the California Legislative Analyst's Office as these being the reasons why their housing problem is so acute. Just last week, front page article in the New York Times about how California's housing problem has gotten worse and worse and worse, to the point where, and it's mostly because local governments have imposed more and more regulations on housing construction and land use. And it's to the point, according to that article, that the state legislature is discussing statewide legislation to preempt and override local legislation that inhibits housing construction. So here we are, we're talking about affordable housing, when the problem, and clearly that's the problem, but we've already agreed that lack of inventory is the root of the problem. So increasing supply in itself helps affordable housing. So when you talk about, oh, should we have incentives for more density because by setting aside units, I think that gets in the way of increasing supply because it assumes that builders will not factor in if it's mandated, the mandates as part of their economic equation. Of course they're going to do that. For example, the editorials that both Arthur and Lori gave last time, at last meeting was, oh, one reason for doing mandatory affordable housing is that you'll get the density you seek by mandating it. Well, that assumes that it won't have any influence on the builder's decision whether to build in the first place. It will have a profound effect on their decision. They may not build in Kenmore at all. Some cities can get away with doing this, imposing mandatory or incentive affordable housing requirements, such as Seattle and Bellevue, because they're job centers, and there's so much demand to be close to those jobs. They have the luxury of having a grand bargain, where they will increase density in some areas in exchange for affordable unit set-asides or fees in lieu of those units. We're not a job center. We don't have cranes all around our city. The affordable housing incentives that Commissioner Vanderline already alluded to, that we've already put into our zoning laws when we rezoned the 522 corridor and we made proposals on the affordable housing issue separately, haven't taken root. We don't see new investors coming here. So why would we impose mandatory requirements that might further dissuade them from doing what we seek to do, which is increase density? That in itself is the most efficient way to reduce housing prices in this area. And Commissioner Vanderline, I think, asked, where are we in the scheme of affordable housing for this region? To my knowledge, we're still at the bottom of the arch list of 15 cities, and it's not close. So we're already very affordable relative to those cities. So I guess the bottom line is I'm not averse to the concept of voluntary affordable housing incentives. I don't think, however, it's the most efficient way to get density. Because if we put, as Planner Anderson pointed out, if we set a base level of density, let's say it's 16 units in the South Juanita zone, and we say you can go up to 24 if you set aside a quarter of those additional units as affordable. There's some question as to whether we'll get to the 24, and if we really want to get to the 24, then we should make it mandatory. I think it's much more efficient to say, make it 24 with no affordable housing requirements, and then you don't have this issue as to whether you get from 16 to 24. You've just increased the density or the housing supply by that much more. So if that's really what you want to do, that is increase density. And there are non-affordability reasons to do that. I assume it's urbanization and walkability and concentration of residents and businesses, which helps reduce traffic congestion. Those are good reasons in themselves for density. But as far as affordability is concerned, if you want to do it for that reason, just let them go up to a certain level. That'll be the most profitable way they can do it without other restrictions on them. It'll be much more likely that it happens. And until we see it popping up all over the place, or until Kenmore becomes a job center, I don't think we impose extra burdens on the builders that we want to attract to our city and increase economic growth and increase density and increase urbanization. And that's about all the oxygen I can afford to suck out of the air right now.
Well said.
Thank you.
Well, I can't really speak for Arthur because he's not here, but I'm sure part of his response would be supply is part of the equation for affordability, but not the only answer. So supply is not going to get you to meet your affordable goals. I'll leave it at that. He could probably go into way more detail and say it far more eloquently. I would just like to kind of bring back an idea that Laurie put out there is if we agree that density is important for the reasons that Commissioner Nugent said, maybe there is sort of a compromise approach, so to say that we agree that there is increased density and you have kind of the ability for the developer to build to an increased density, and if they want to get any more, there is a optional approach to get an even higher density. So essentially, you've kind of got the best of both worlds there. You have the ability, you give the developer the ability to build the density, and if they want to go a little bit more, then they can do that, but there has to be an affordable housing component. That would then meet not only your density goals, but also some of your affordable housing goals as well.
Thank you. Now, and I'm going to disagree with that, because if you want to induce the builders to go up to the highest level of density, you don't put any requirements on it. And yes, that means you don't have the 60% unit as 1 out of 4, but the risk is it never gets built in the first place if you do impose those requirements, even if they're voluntary. If you've got a base density of 16 and you say, hey, you can get up to 24 if you make 2 of those new units affordable, that may not pencil out for the developer, but what will certainly pencil out for the developer is going up to 24. So if that's what you really want them to do, set it at 24 with no restrictions.
I guess it's up for decision. We're looking for direction from the Commission at this point.
And it's a legitimate point that you made. I'm not here to criticize. I'm just here to disagree.
I just wanted to put that on the table to get sort of the whole picture out there.
So
Yeah, I might.
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
if you
Yeah.
have it.
I'll let the
This
Commissioner
is an
go. And then
unfair question, probably without Arthur here, but in case anyone on the staff or commission has a better memory than I do on our affordable housing conversations, what other incentive tools does the city have available beyond density bonuses? If you make a good argument where legislation can get in the way of best,
intentions.
yeah,
Yeah.
what other tools are available and have we discussed for incenting developers to create affordable housing units not tied to density?
Right. So height is one. Parking, reduced parking is another one. The reduced parking is used in the city's transit-oriented development district. Permit fees, reduced permit fees, things that aren't sort of related to land use. Can you think of other?
There's the multifamily tax exemption for affordable housing, and that is in place for the Kenmore Village site over here. That was utilized. It's only in place for that limited area, but that is another tool.
Yeah. I think the one comment I wanted to make, I certainly understand both sides of this issue, but the one thing that I don't want us to lose sight of is that if the density moves, for example, in the North Community Business Area from 8 dwelling units per acre to 36 dwelling units per acre, that's a huge windfall for the property owner. That's a huge increase in density, which is a good thing. I mean, as I said earlier, we want that density in that area for a variety of reasons. On the one hand. On the other hand is putting some responsibility back on the developer at a level that we think is not going to impact their profit margin. Is it inappropriate to ask that that public benefit be given back in terms of affordable housing?
Okay. So this is kind of, the issue that we left for this meeting or future meetings was what do we do with the affordable housing issue? That's the one we haven't really accepted a recommendation on. I don't think we formally accepted staff recommendations on the others, but I don't think there was much further discussion as we went through it. Does that sound right? Yes. Okay. So I think what we should do is take up, we've already discussed affordable housing and get a motion on the table and see where we are on that. So if anybody, I invite anybody if he wants to make a motion, kind of noodling what I might do in terms of a motion. I think I'm willing to put a motion. I don't see a lot of energy here on the, the.
It might come when you say something.
Yeah, really, and it should. It should. My motion would be to, and it's consistent with what I've said, is to propose and come up with density levels for these two areas, higher density levels, but not impose affordability requirements, because I think where our city is economically and with housing, it would get in the way of what we seek in terms of increasing supply of housing in this city and would make it more likely that developers would build what we're seeking to have them build. So I think my motion is that we not adopt, I think the simplest way to phrase it is that we not adopt extra, quote, affordability requirements. And I put it in quotes because the increase in density is itself an affordability feature of our zoning process. Do I hear a second? Thank you. Discussion? Commissioner?
I wouldn't want to see the city give up the potential benefit of that it ought to achieve by offering up additional density and increasing the property values. And that's a traditional way for cities of all size to manage and handle the increased cost of development and growth in their cities in order to fund different amenities. What I've continuing, also going back in the back of my mind, is where we can create this new funding source by increasing the density. What we seem to have gone to without, at least in my memory, sufficient enough discussion is, why do we want to invest this dollars only in affordable housing? The city has other needs and other amenities that it has trouble funding. I mentioned parks, streets. We have other public needs for this funding. Why are we only thinking about affordable housing as a use for this?
So are you thinking of a fee in lieu requirement with increased density?
Well, the problem is we haven't had that discussion.
Yeah.
And we haven't had the discussion of weighing the value of affordable housing, which I don't reject at all, against other alternative uses, and we haven't really talked to the community about where would they rather see this new funding, how would we like to see that used. And that troubles me because it feels like we're moving immediately into one option without a whole lot of discussion of alternatives.
That's a good point. You know, I'm thinking, that brings to mind something, you know, if we are, and maybe this is the compromise position I'm more comfortable with, instead of maximizing our potential density for these areas, we come up with sort of a middle ground number, and we could always increase it in the future if we think, okay, we think this area is adapted to the increased density well, we think it's suited for yet more density, and at that point, we can come up with either affordable housing proposal or just increased density proposal or a fee in lieu proposal, whether it's earmarked or not, so the city does get some kind of remuneration without, you know, at least we get the development ball rolling with an increase in density without restrictions. We do it up to a certain point now. Maybe it's instead of 36, we go to 24 in one zone. Instead of 24, we go to 16 in the other zone. We sort of reserve the potential for having this discussion at a later point after something starts happening in those areas.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. I was thinking earlier, but I wanted to see how the conversation evolved, about this idea of finding that middle ground with the opportunity for increased density, perhaps with the offset with the affordable housing units. But if we're not ready, and I like the idea, Scott, of starting somewhere. I'm just not sure maybe those residential neighborhoods are the starting point or the experimental spots. They might be, and they're certainly instant opportunities, right? But to conditionally put in or provisionally put in that opportunity, provisional upon the agreement, maybe at a city council level or at our level, of a broader affordable housing strategy, to Mike's point, which would take into account trade-offs like other municipal services, right, which we haven't really weighed that out. But that opportunity to have that provision in there for the increased density in exchange for affordable housing units, but conditional upon some future deliberation or some future strategic milestone that we haven't reached yet, but preserve the opportunity to do it, not lose the opportunity, as Arthur perhaps warns against. I don't know if there's a process for conditional, almost placeholder language in an agreement like this, but to say something like a density that we could agree to, right, maybe a little bit higher than is there now, and not as high as we would ultimately go with offset for additional housing unit. And then the trigger event for that is some future master plan for affordable housing.
Commissioner McDonald.
Yeah, I like what Commissioner Vanderline said about fee and lieu. You know, it's more economic to manage that because they just pay money and it's done. And but I wouldn't want to give up our bargaining chip by incrementally bringing up the density. I think we need to get our value out of it for the city, for whatever use they want to use it for parks, for instance, or if you want to help somebody with rent, you know, subsidy, that might be a more economic way to do it rather than having this people submitting tax returns every year and all that stuff. So a fee in lieu, for my thinking, is much more less costly to manage. But I wouldn't want to go. I think we got to, if we're going to increase the density, we need to implement something like that. You know, like, you know, it's like having sidewalks put in, or, you know, get something out of it, because the developer, the owner, is going to have you know, it contributes to the city.
Well, I think we already do, and I think maybe Lori could talk to concurrency and mitigation requirements when anybody develops property.
Right. To the question of why would the public benefit go to affordable housing to the exclusion of other things, actually any new development in the city at this point is needing to pay traffic impact fees that contribute to the transportation system improvements, and parks impact fees that contribute to park improvements. So at least in those two areas, new development, separate from whatever is done with affordable housing, they are contributing, assuming that the new development needs those services, they contribute money for those services.
Where are concurrency fees, how do they measure up against other cities around here? Are they considered high? Are they in the middle? Are they low?
I don't know if I can answer that. Do you know?
Impact fees?
Yeah.
They're not the highest, and they're not the lowest. There are, I think we're probably towards the higher end than the lower end. I don't remember the number off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But that number is not come up within a vacuum. That number is based on a formula and logic to sort of say that based on the improvements infrastructure improvements that you need to support growth, there's a mathematical formula that comes out with this number at the end.
Yeah, thank you. But the council does look at what surrounding cities are charging for their concurrency or their impact fees, and they try to figure, okay, what can we expect?
They do look at that. They did look at that when they recently adopted the latest impact fees. Like I say, there is a formula to get to what that is. The council could go lower than that number, but not higher than that number, and they chose to stay at the number that the formula gave.
But our formula, I'm trying to infer from you kind of where we are relative to other cities, and it sounds like we're a little on the high end. Is that right?
A little on the high end, but I think there's some rationale and logic behind that. It's not an arbitrary number. It's based on the level of infrastructure needs to support the growth, and that's the number that makes sense then for new development. That's the number that comes out, the per unit number.
So I ask those questions because for us to impose any additional conditions on development in this city makes us less attractive relative to other cities around here. And we're not getting a lot of investment for multifamily housing and mixed use, obviously virtually none for mixed use, for commercial. So before we think, I agree with the concept of getting public compensation for granting this property value windfall to the current property owners and this opportunity for builders. If we're already not attracting them, I don't think we increase the burdens on them to build in our city. So, because we already have some concurrency, we have impact fees when they do build, I don't think that's going to help create what we're looking for with the rezone, create the multifamily, create the increased housing stock, create the urbanization that we're hoping to get. And again, it's sort of, I think we'd be asking too much, given where our city is economically and where we fit into the bigger economic region. Go ahead, Commissioner.
I'd like to add also that in that vein, these two business zones are relatively small. It's different when you're on Aurora and you don't have a huge piece of property, but the additional density on, say, Aurora going into the city is far more valuable to that metropolitan area than higher density on Simons. They're just not the same. It's apples and oranges. I get the trend thinking, and we need to put this density in place, the zone, so that we could attract urbanization and ease the housing crunch, and and then also think about adding the affordable housing piece there, because we have a concern about that in our city. I just think that you are doing a balancing act that you might not win at if you think about what it costs to purchase the land and then jump through all the hoops to do the development. If that is really the goal, is to get those properties moving, I don't know how else to describe that, and we want them to move towards density, then we need to pick a number and then let the chips fall where they may.
Let the market forces play out.
Because we don't know how long. What we do know in downtown Seattle is that they're at their peak, and they know for sure within 2 years the peak's going to fall. That's what they know now. So if you think about the waves of building that come out into these communities, we've always kind of been behind the wave. And what we don't want to do is be behind the wave and not see any building. That's what I'm hearing.
Commissioner Vanderlyn?
I want to respect the motion that's on the table here.
Yes.
Which I think I'm going to withdraw or vote against because we're fleshing this out.
Yeah, we need to have a clearer one, I think, a specific.
Maybe, but go ahead, Commissioner.
But the statement I was going to make is
Yeah.
I do think there is a significant additional value, whether we're talking about these two small parcels or the city as a whole, in being able to offer increased density as an option. There is a substantial increase in the value of the property, and I think probably to the developer as well, who eventually has this. And I think the city needs to capture some of that. I do respect the idea that we are charging impact fees, but I don't think we would look at any of those impact fees as really being sufficient to offset that or mitigate the additional cost to the city or the impact to the citizenry of significant increase in density. There's got to be, this is an opportunity for the city, particularly outside of property taxes, to be able to realize those dollars. So I think it's something that we have to consider in here. Again, respecting the motion, but what would make me comfortable would be if we did something along the lines of, yes, I think increasing the density is a good idea. And this is probably a couple of limited places where we could do this in kind of an experimental way to see how the market responds to it. I could see doing that, increasing the densities. If we did that, I would suggest that we adopt the optional approach, which allows the developers the opportunity to be able to assess the economy and build to what the economy wants. And on the affordable housing side, they would have an option of earning the additional density by offering up a certain proportion of affordable housing, or the certain number of dollar in lieu of fee that would be in the discretion of the city council to use for the benefit of the community. So we're not necessarily allocating all of the value of the benefit to affordable housing. There's an opportunity in here to capture that increased value for other needs that the city might have in the future and we might not be able to anticipate.
Thank you. Yeah, Commissioner Baker.
So just to clarify, would that mean that by doing that optional approach, it actually opens up, like we've talked about before, more flexibility for the city to work with a developer to come up with higher density, but we're not losing the affordability option totally? Is that what you're
in my
hearing?
mind? And I think in particular, keeping in mind that we still haven't done that citywide assessment,
No.
that this gives us this gives the city council the opportunity to be able to come back and weigh the alternatives and to determine what our real goals are in terms of affordable housing are, and what might our other goals be, and what might be other services that we would want to support.
And I also remember when we did the affordable housing discussion, we talked about these are not current projects that are even being considered but could be in the future, and that is working with the county to create affordable housing in our overlay. But again, it's not something that the city's working on currently, but it might come at a future date. And without looking at those affordable housing true numbers, what do we have available? It's hard to come up with a recommendation for the council that is mandatory. You know, if you want to go up to these higher densities, then this is the mandatory affordable housing contribution. Especially if at a later date we get something that exceeds whatever our affordable housing requirements in the county to be a player in the whole affordable housing market partnership. And, you know, I think it makes it hard to come up with, we don't have a crystal ball, we do not know what is going to happen in the future that might move that crisis to a simmer and not boiling hot, or the other way around, where it continues to escalate and cities are motivated to partner in a way that does mandate that. I just think at this moment in time, to attract the type of development with moderate density, to put a bunch of restrictions and mandatory doesn't make sense. So, you know, we don't really have a formal motion. We're kind of playing around with getting closer to
We actually
it.
do have a motion, but
do you want
but
to
you're right.
modify?
Our discussion's gone beyond that, and I think that's healthy.
Yeah.
But what I want to do, and I don't want to cut you off.
No,
so
it's
if you're
okay.
okay, so I do want to take up the motion, and I realize, you know, the motion on its face doesn't prevent us from coming up with a compromised density number later. So I'm still going to stand behind this motion, and I do want to ask staff about impact fees again, because I think, and unless I misunderstood Commissioner Vanderline, he was suggesting that the impact fees may not compensate the city sufficiently for the burdens that the density we're thinking of might impose. But aren't the impact fees, isn't that formula for impact fees related to that increase in density? So that it shouldn't be proportional to, the fees would go up in proportion to the increase in density?
Well, there are two components. One, right, one is the impact fees, and that's based on a set of proposed traffic or park improvements that the city developed, assuming that growth was going to occur at a certain level. And so those impact fees are charged per unit, and the larger your development, the more you pay in those fees. The other piece of it, which we're not discussing here, is that whenever a new development comes in, then there's an assessment of whether they are, at least for transportation, whether they are providing what's called safe site access. So there are sometimes street or sidewalk or road improvements that are required that specifically related to a development on a piece of property. So those are the two components.
Okay. Anything else?
The other thing I want to just say on impact fees is that for affordable housing, there is the ability, I think, to get a reduction or a waiver on the traffic and park impact fees, so it's not sort of an additive, so you're not getting kind of dinged if you had an affordable housing component to say, I have to pay the impact fees, because you're then looking at the affordable housing as sort of a benefit and then allowing some reduction then on the traffic and park impact fee payment. Off the top of my head, I honestly can't remember what that reduction or waiver is, but there are provisions in the code.
So in
for that.
addition to getting the ability to build more units, if they set aside some as affordable, they get a reduction in impact fees.
Yes.
Okay. It's a double incentive or additional incentive. I want to open the floor still to any further discussion of the pending motion, if there is any. Commissioner McDonald?
I just would add that, you could, do we really need to get these properties developed more right now? I mean, is there a rush? I don't know that there is. And if you do the voluntary affordable housing solution, and if it doesn't develop, you could always, revisit it 3 years down the road if it doesn't work. I'm not sold on that. We need to increase the density right now and get nothing for it, even if it's just a modest increase. We can wait. There's not a big rush, in my opinion.
Thank you. But that brings to mind what Commissioner Baker said, and I agree with. We are in an opportune time for this. There is some value in urbanization. Apart from increasing housing stock in this city, if it's going to happen, and it hasn't happened to any material extent, it has in the single-family context, where parcels are being subdivided and new houses are being put up. But in terms of multifamily, it hasn't happened that I can see. So I agree with what Commissioner Baker said about the wave, and we don't know when it's going to end. But if we want to see any of this happen, this is a pretty good chance to do it. And the other thing is, again, we keep using affordable housing in reference only to the set-asides, but to increase the housing stock in itself, that's the key economic question that underlies this whole issue. We increase the housing stock. That's the vast majority of housing. We think of affordable housing units and how it'll make it more affordable. It really only affects a very small fraction of people in relation to everybody, all the people living in housing in this city. What really drives this issue, what really helps resolve this issue is a broader increase in housing supply, which is what we're proposing to do. Anyway, that's my rebuttal there. Anything else? Okay, I think the motion is right for a vote. Commissioner Vice Chair.
Repeat the motion.
The motion is to not adopt affordable housing set-asides without, however, addressing the density issue, which we can address separately, but with in mind increasing density for purposes of increasing housing stock. Does that sound right? I think Dennis seconded the motion. Does that sound right to you? Okay.
Can you say it again?
Yeah, to not adopt the proposed affordable housing set-asides, optional or mandatory.
I'm confused why we need a motion to not do something.
So that we can take up density would then take up the density issue without having settled the fact that we're not going to impose these additional requirements.
Are you sure that requires a motion?
No, it doesn't require it, but I think if we set a position and we agree on that part of it, it makes it easier to address the second part of it. Tia?
I have the motion as propose higher density with no affordability requirements.
Thank you. That's a better way. Yeah, that makes more sense because we're going to get to that anyway. But you're right, Mike, that's a good point. We are agreeing to higher density, then we can address it more specifically, but do it without the extra requirements for affordable set-asides. Does that make sense to the Commissioner Olson, who seconded the motion? Any further questions about the content of the motion? Are we good on that?
So that precludes no affordable housing component along the lines of what was suggested as some kind of incremental. Is that right? I just want to be clear what we're
That's
voting
my intent.
on. Okay.
I think it's Commissioner Olson's intent. All right, so we're ready to vote. All in favor of the motion, raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All opposed, raise your hand and say nay.
Nay.
Nays have it. Motion fails. So I think we're at either further discussion in broad terms, or we're ready for another motion.
Well, I think the motion should be that we should recommend higher density, which I don't know what that should be, but there should be an optional clause which gives the city a bit of leeway to work with a builder to cover potential affordable housing needs, which we don't know what those are, but at least it has the option there.
Commissioner Vanderline?
Just offer maybe a revision of the wording.
Okay.
If you excuse my wordsmithing, I'd suggest that we accept the density recommendations provided by staff, that those increased density would be available to developers if, one, under optionally they provided affordable housing, or as a second option they would provide a cash in lieu payment, the equivalent of the value of that affordable housing to be used at the discretion of the city council. Does that capture what?
That's an enhanced motion, and I like it.
Okay, do I hear a second?
I'll second it.
Okay. What was the staff recommendation on density?
Whoop, sorry. So the staff recommendation was different in the two areas. In the south area, the recommendation was that it go to 24 units per acre. And on the way it was phrased in the charts was actually a base density of 18, but you could go to 24 with affordable housing stuff. But now we're kind of moving away from that chapter in the zoning code that hasn't been used about residential density incentives. So I would assume that it would go just to 24. So it'd go from 8 to 24. And at the north, it would go from 8 to 36.
Okay, so the motion is to increase density in the zones, the north zone to 36 and the south zone to 24, and have an option for affordable housing incentives above that? Is that right?
No.
Okay.
I think originally we're talking there was a base density.
The base would continue to be 8, and then you could go to 24 or to 36 with
If you set aside affordable housing units.
Right.
Okay.
I want to, because you're actually talking now about numbers, I want to just make one comment, which is in the south neighborhood business zone, there is kind of an incentive to do mixed use. So I hate to bring this into this discussion, but you could think about whether you wanted an interim step, like you can do 8 as your base, and if you do mixed use, you can go to 12, and if you do affordability, you can go to 24 or something like that. I know this is complicating the issue, so if you want to just step back and talk about affordability, I understand that, but that's a permutation that is in the current regs that we haven't talked about.
Okay. Well, go ahead, Commissioner.
I'm intrigued by your suggestion for the south area. Could we make, maybe this isn't the way to do it, but could we have, with mixed use, a density higher than 8, and then, as you said, you could go above that new mixed use threshold if you either added affordable housing or you provided cash in lieu payment?
Yeah, you could do a 3-tier approach if that's what you wanted to do.
I'm trying to give the developer as much flexibility as they possibly can, and I think mixed use is probably certainly compatible with the south parcel.
So I'm trying to understand the motion. My job is to simply paraphrase it once it's agreed upon. I think we're in a fluid situation here. So I think the motion's being worked on. And I don't know if Commissioner Baker and Commissioner McDonald, Commissioner Vanderline want to keep talking about where to finalize this motion. Maybe that's a more efficient way to go before I try to paraphrase it.
I can revise the motion, how's that?
It's your motion, right?
Oh, no,
It doesn't matter. What's that?
Carol's.
We haven't voted on it, so.
No, we haven't. So, and that's it. I haven't even paraphrased it. That's why I'm trying, if you guys want to revise something, I think that's fine, because there's really nothing on the floor yet.
Maybe the best way to state this is for the north parcel, we are agreeing with the city, with the staff's recommendation for density, which would allow a higher density above the base level if the developer offered either affordable, at the developer's option, they could earn higher density by providing affordable housing or providing cash payments in lieu that would be equal to the value of the same value of those affordable housing.
Right.
In the southern area, we would agree with the base, I think it's 8, that staff has recommended. We would add in a intermediate base of, let's say, 12 units if the developer was offering to build multi-use there. If they were also, in addition, willing to provide affordable housing, they could increase the density up to, what was it, 24? 24. They could earn the 24 by either offering to build affordable housing units, or they could provide in lieu cash payments to be used at the city council's discretion.
That was pretty well done, considering how much there's on the table there. Would it be a little simpler to break the motion into each separate region?
Yes, that's what I was trying to do, is differentiate. If you want to have 2 separate
Yeah, I
motions,
think
that would be
let's
fine.
focus on each region. And one reason I say that is I'm wondering, because I agree with Commissioner Vanderline that Lori's proposal about mixed use is intriguing. And in fact, I think that's the preferred kind of development we'd want to see, given the lack of economic base that we have in this city. And I don't know why we would not have that incentive in the north region. Do we want to, I mean, I would be inclined to say, give them an incentive to do mixed use in the north region. Go ahead, Lori.
I would agree with you, except that in the north region, for multifamily, you cannot have multifamily unless you do mixed use. It's
already built in.
It's already built in.
Oh.
Correct. It is not built into the existing neighborhood business zone, but it is built into community business.
Well, what about the incentive part of it? So you're saying it's already required to be mixed use
Correct.
to take advantage of the residential density.
Correct.
But what about, is there an incentive element to that, or do we want to propose something that gives them the incentive to do mixed use?
Well,
I guess the incentive's already there.
Yeah, they can't.
They can't do any density multifamily without doing mixed
without the mixed use.
It would remain 8 per unit, and the incentive is the
to
mixed
go to
use.
36.
And to go higher, it's at the option of affordability, trading, or payment in lieu.
Right.
All second. Well, let me clarify.
Yeah,
Get the
let's
motion
get it-
straight first.
yeah.
Do we want to do 2 separate motions, one
I
for
think
each
it would be
area?
I think it would be
Yeah, let's
clear.
just
Because they are already zoned differently.
Let's be
So I think
clear
I would
about
simplify it. So let's go with the north. Go ahead, Debbie.
Just one little technical thing. I know, and I apologize. Commissioner Vanderline was saying the fee to be used for affordable housing or at the council discretion. So I'm not sure how much discretion legally there is to use these fees. So I'm not an attorney. We have 2 here. So maybe we could say a fee in lieu to be used for affordable housing or as allowed by law, something like that.
Yeah, you're thinking about. I think you're talking about the. What's the word they use? You can only impose on a builder impact fees related to the burden they create in the city. You can't ask them to do more than the burden they're creating. Is that what you're getting at?
I think there's the nexus there
There's a
argument
word,
that you're
there's a
getting at.
nexus,
It's
right.
the nexus argument,
Right.
but it's also, I don't know if he's saying we're collecting this fee for affordable housing, and by the way, we're going to put it over here for building a park. I don't know if you can. I don't know if you can or you can't. So all I'm saying is just
The
saying
extent allowed by law.
extent allowed by law kind of leaves it open in a more legal way, I guess.
If that's what you...
If that's what you want to do.
Let me just say this, reword this, or to make sure that we're thinking about this the right way. I see the builder has two options. One, they can earn additional density by building affordable housing units, or they can make a cash in lieu payment that would be at discretion may not be the right word, but be available to the city council to use for any purpose allowed by law.
Okay.
I think we have our motion. So that's the North District, right? Is that the right, what are we calling that district?
It's the Community Business Juanita sub-area, but you
Got
can
a few
call
more
it the
words?
North
We only got
District.
Community Business Juanita sub-area.
Right.
It's only 4 words. All right.
Which is the north.
At Northeast 170th Street.
170th.
All right.
And Simon.
And so the density, the base density would be 8 and up to 36. Is,
Yes.
okay.
All right. I think I get it. I don't think I'm going to improve on Commissioner Vanderleid's phrasing here, but I'll try and paraphrase it. Because it doesn't hurt.
No.
Okay, the proposed motion is to adopt the staff's recommendation for increased density for the Community Business Juanita sub-area, which is from 8 units, increasing density from 8 residential units to 36, provided that the property owner set aside the affordable housing units at a ratio of, I mean, you didn't get into this, but is it at the ratio of 1 to 4
Yeah,
that the
it's the
staff
staff
had proposed? Ratio of 1 to 4, that is 1 affordable unit for every 4 additional units they're allowed to build, or make a fee in lieu payment to the city as allowed by law. Does that sound right?
Yep.
Okay.
And that's on the north.
That's solely on the Community Business Juanita sub-area, which is 170th Street.
I go north and south.
Go with Manhattan Express. That is the Manhattan Express sub-area.
Exactly.
They'll help us. Okay. Jim's Inglewood Auto sub-area. Right. That's your sub-area. Edmund sub-area. All right. That's the motion. Do I hear a second?
I second it.
Okay. Any further discussion? Commissioner Olson.
I am concerned that we make a change and we exact a price for it. And I'm still sort of going back to the issue of flexibility for the developer. I think I would prefer it being part of an overall picture where instead of the base being 8, maybe it's 12 as an encouragement for mixed use, and then start adding on the other stuff. Then the developer can sort of play it out, see which happens.
Okay. Anybody else? Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Vice Chair? No? Go ahead, Commissioner Mulcair.
I agree with Dennis. I think the Planner Anderson mentioned this earlier, that this is at a base of 8, that's essentially what's R6 is our standard residential community, right? This is essentially single-family density now. That, Dennis, if your point is that our base is not high enough, I agree with you. I think the base is too low, and the gap between the base and the buy-up to maximum density is quite big. There's no intermediary steps. There aren't. It's almost binary, right? You either accept the base or you buy your way up to the maximum. My other concern is the language of any purpose allowed by law. I think that is very, we are vulnerable on that. I think that, not legally, but this can be gamed. This can become then just a tax to buy density. it loses any correlation to affordable housing if the law allows this to be used for city council members' salary increases or whatever they choose to use it for. I would not mind seeing language that keeps this related to affordable housing issues. Just a concern. Otherwise, I'm not sure why we're doing it.
Anybody want to? Yes, Commissioner Vanderlei.
I don't have a hard objection to increasing the base, just as long as we realize that by increasing the base, we are passing economic benefit to the property owner, potentially to the developer, without asking for any public benefit back out of that.
Okay.
But we also created the limitation by having a base currently of 8, and we're recognizing that the environment is changing. So you can argue it either way, but I'm just trying to get multiple options and flexibility to the developer. And I was picking that number because it's sort of half of what we thought we wanted to get to. So that's my concept.
Commissioner Baker.
So my question is, that zone recommendation for 8 units per acre was a staff recommendation as the base. Is that correct?
No. The staff recommendation before the whole affordable housing discussion was that we parallel the existing community business zone, where actually there is a minimum density requirement. You can't build less than 18, and the base density is 24, and you can go up to 36.
And that mirrors the commercial business zones that it's
right,
closest to.
Right, correct. Correct.
Okay, so if we're accepting the staff recommendation, then 8 units per acre isn't even in there, right?
Well, again, Commissioner Baker, the staff recommendation was made before the whole affordable housing conversation was started.
Okay.
With the affordable housing conversation, you have 2 approaches. You say you can go from 8 to 36, which is a great big windfall,
yeah.
and then you do affordable housing. Or you could say you can do that minimum density 18, or you can go to 36. We haven't really talked about where that midpoint would be if you wanted to add a midpoint.
Okay, that helps.
So just to clarify, the current zoning is what?
The current neighborhood business zoning is 8. That's the reason the staff recommendation is different is because we're moving to a different zone. We're moving to community business, which has different standards. But the change for the property owner, in reality, will be from 8 to wherever we go.
So,
because that's the current zoning.
Okay, thank you. That helps. So if we continue with our intent, which was to rezone this to community business, the 18 is the new base. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is, yes, this is kind of complicated. So I'll tell you what the community business zone standard is, and then we can, let me get to the right page here. So in the community business zone, the current base density is 24, but the minimum density, this is a zone that has a minimum density. You cannot build below 18. So even though in zones where you have a base density, you could build at 5, you could build at 10, you could build at whatever you wanted, but it had to be less than the base. In this zone, you cannot build less than 18.
So
and that's because they wanted higher density.
Right, I think being consistent with the rest of the community business zone is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then, if I
And then
understand
the
you
maximum-
correctly, they're required, if they want to do, they have an incentive to build, they can build up, they have to build up to 18 in order to include mixed use.
No, in that zone, it doesn't have anything to do with that. If you, in the north area, you can't do multifamily unless it's in mixed use. So mixed use is off the table relative to the density incentives. It makes no difference. So again, minimum 18, base 24, maximum 36. That's just the community business zone. If you all want to do something different, you can do that. You can say, in this zone, it's 8 dwelling units per acre is the base, and you can go to 36 with affordable housing. If you're more comfortable saying, no, you can go to 18, and then if you want to go to 36, that's maybe more of a parallel to community business.
Okay.
Go
Thank
ahead.
you. That's helpful. If the other seconds on this are amenable, I would say yes, let's make this compatible with the rest of the community business zone and with a minimum density of 18 that they can then earn up to the 36 if they...
From a base of 24,
From a base of
before you trigger any quid pro quo.
I don't think it's 24. I think it's 18 is the minimum.
18 is the minimum, 24 is the base.
So you can go up to 24 with no affordable housing concern.
Right.
And then to get from 24 to 36, you need to make an accommodation.
Right. Or you could make the base 18. You see what I'm
I like
saying?
the 1824.
Well, yes, I think the key is to make it consistent with the
Okay.
rest of the zone, so we're not creating unintended incentives
Complexity.
here of one part of the city
Right.
versus another one.
Right.
That's not what we wanted to do. We want this to
Okay.
actually look and be treated as part of the community business.
All right, so then in the north zone, it would be 24 as the base, 18 as the minimum, and 36 with the affordable housing option.
Yes. Okay. Is that amenable? Is that, we've got a revision on the motion. Is that, do we have a second on that proposed revised motion?
I think Carol was the second.
I know, that's what I'm trying to.
I want to hear it repeated again.
No, I'm happy to do it. I think I get it, so I'm willing to swing at it. So the proposal Commissioner Vanderline is making, based on the staff's additional information, is that we increase the density for residential in the community business Juanita sub-area, which is northeast 170th, to a minimum, to the commercial business density levels, which is a minimum density of 18 units, a base density, which means without any additional requirements, you can build up to 24 units per acre, and then above 24 up to 36 units could be done if you set aside a proportionate 1-to-4 ratio of units for affordable housing, or a fee in lieu that's commensurate for affordable housing. Well, I don't know. Are we at affordable housing? Oh, can the fee in use be used for something other than affordable housing?
Yes. We said there would be any legal use.
Right. To the extent permitted by law. That's Commissioner Vanderline's revised motion.
Yeah, I did, but and so did mine. I think that it should be anything related to impacts from the development.
Well, that has to be. Isn't that the legal requirement?
Usually,
Isn't that the nexus
the
requirement?
nexus argument is if there are the public benefit cannot exceed the private impact. There has to be equal.
Oh, that is different.
That's different.
Yeah.
So
It's just a measure of the impact fee is commensurate with the impact on the public. So that could be used, as Commissioner Mulcair was suggesting, for something completely unrelated and maybe inappropriate.
But do we want to close that loophole?
That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
But Commissioner Vanderline has made, I mean, to my understanding, is he's saying it should be broader and potentially any use permitted by law. So I think that's what we have to take up. Is there a second for Commissioner Vanderline's proposed motion? Yes, Commissioner.
It wasn't my intent to make this as open-ended as
Okay.
we now see it to be. So is there, in the knowledge of the staff or anyone on the commission, a way to limit the cash in lieu to an appropriate use or a use related to the general public benefit. I'm fishing in deep waters here.
Well, I think we kind of have that.
That's
Didn't you say it was
it's
related
written
to-
it's written that way right now. I think the question then is that if you are giving a fee in lieu for affordable housing, the question is where should that fee go to? The straightforward approach would be you giving a fee for affordable housing, then you should expend it related to affordable housing. That's the simplest approach, and we're getting into this area now where could you make it somewhat broader than that, and what would that be? And that's where I'm really struggling with how to word that in a way that would, I don't know if you can do that or not.
Well, the impact fees are limited to things. I thought you said traffic and parks.
That's correct. So if you pay a traffic impact fee, then you're basically expending that for traffic improvements.
Right.
And it's citywide. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you build a development in Street A, you have to do the improvements in Street A. You could build the improvements in Street B. But there is that relationship between impact and public benefit. They're in the same pot, whether it's traffic impact fees paying for traffic improvements, park impact fees paying for park improvements.
So what if we put those constraints on the fee in lieu? It's 3 categories.
Yes.
Yeah.
Affordable housing, traffic, or parks. Okay, and I think Commissioner Vanderline's up for that. How about a second on that proposed motion? Anybody?
It sounds okay to me.
You want to second it?
No.
You just want to vote on it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll second it.
Okay, Commissioner Vice Chair.
No, I just want to.
All right, so I think we have a motion on the table. Do anybody want me to paraphrase?
Yes, please.
All right. Hold on. All right. The proposal is to increase density in the community business Juanita sub-area to the community business zone levels, which is a minimum of 18 residential units, a base of 24 residential units, and a potential with affordable housing compensation to 36 residential units. The affordable housing ratio would be 1 affordable residential unit for every 4 additional units you build above the base, or a fee in lieu commensurate with that affordable housing requirement that could be used for affordable housing, traffic, or parks purposes. Does that sound right?
Yes.
That's very good.
Do we hear, and then we already have a second, so that's, everybody's in agreement with what the motion
Can I
is.
just confirm one thing?
Yes, please.
The comment was that by doing this, that will encourage multi-use.
Mixed use is a requirement in that zone.
Right. Okay. Any further discussion now that we have the motion revised? I'm going to, just for the record, I'm not here to convince anybody because my motion failed, but I agree with Commissioner Olson in that the way to generate development at this point in time in this city would be to impose the fewest possible restrictions on development. I agree with Commissioner Olson that we should do this in a piecemeal way and not maximize our density goal yet, that we should let the market play out and see if it meets a lesser density goals. Commissioner Olson said 16. I would say something like that, 18. And then in the future, if we see that happening, then create affordability incentives. But I'm not here to revisit that motion that failed. I'm just putting that on the record so that when I vote no, people aren't angry. All right. Having said that, any further discussion? There being none, we're ready to vote on the motion. All in favor, raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
1, 2, I'm sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. All opposed, raise your hand and say nay. Nay. Any abstentions? Okay. And we have an abstention. So the motion carries. A vote of 5 yeas, 1 nay, and 1 abstention. Is that correct? All right. Now we move on to the south Are we calling it the neighborhood business zone or a community neighborhood business zone? What's the exact name? Is it simply the Juanita neighborhood business zone?
Nope, just neighborhood business.
Neighborhood business zone on the south end of Juanita. Do we have a motion for that area?
I'll venture a
yes,
motion.
Yes.
I would start with the very same language we used for the North Juanita, clarifying that we want to have the density requirements that the staff has recommended specific to this community, or to this neighborhood business zone, which, as I recall, is we're moving the base is 8, and they could move up to 36?
24.
To 24, I'm sorry, yes, thank you, that's important.
It was 8 to 12 with mixed use, and then to 24 with affordability.
Right. Or in lieu.
Right.
So do we have a base of 8 and then an incentive to 12 for mixed use and then a further incentive to 24 with affordability or a fee in lieu? Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
Is that the motion?
That's the motion.
Okay.
So what's the base? 8?
8.
Yeah.
Okay.
Questions? Oh, is there a second? That's the next thing. Is there a second for that motion, or do we need to paraphrase it again?
I'll second it.
I am confused about
Okay.
the base.
Okay.
What the old base is and what the new one is.
I think it's the same. Because it's a neighborhood business
Yeah,
zone,
'cause
so we're
it-
not adopting a whole zoning pattern or density
why I
pattern
just wanna make
as we
sure
did with the other one.
Because this was,
So the base is 8.
Right.
So we don't have a ground, it doesn't sound like.
The middle ground is 12 for mixed use.
Okay.
so the incentive is to do the mixed use.
Yes, well,
Okay.
then I'm fine, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Any paraphrasing or clarification needed? We have a motion, we have a second. Who gave the second? Was it Commissioner Baker? Commissioner
No.
McDonald? We have 10 people ready to second this. All right.
Scott did. Scott.
That- All right. So we have the motion. Do any further clarification? Or are we pretty good? We're comfortable with the content?
I just want to.
Yeah, please, Vice Chair.
Okay, so the mixed-use requirement kicks in at 12 and continues up to 24?
No, to get to 12.
To get to 12 from 8, you got to do mixed-use. But to go from 12 to 24, you got to do affordable housing, but there's no mixed-use requirement? There still is, so that mixed-use requirement starts at 12, continues to 24, along with the affordable housing. Okay, I just wanted to be clear on
The
that.
mixed
Okay.
use
That's a good point.
starts at 8. It starts at 12. So what happens between 8 and 12?
8 and 12, you could do townhomes.
Good.
Whoa.
Wait a minute.
That's different from what I thought.
You can do up to 11.
I thought what we had said was that the current base is 8.
Correct.
You could go up to 12 with mixed use.
Correct.
And then above 12, you could go to 24 if you did either affordable housing or in lieu. Right,
That was my understanding, so I would
Right.
think 9 would require mixed use.
Oh. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Well, how did townhomes jump into
Yeah.
this?
Well, boy. So in the South Neighborhood Business Zone, we don't have the same requirement as in the North, where you can only do residential in mixed use.
Right.
So at the South, you can do either mixed use or you can do standalone townhomes.
Oh. Do we want that? That's standalone up to 12?
No, it would be up to 8.
Okay.
So then the market would drive that.
Can I, standalone townhome sounds like an oxymoron. A townhome, by definition,
Is
shares a wall.
attached, right? Yeah, there.
So it's not standing alone.
No, that's
Jumbo
just
shrimp.
It's an exactly. It's a very good point. The current language is standalone townhome, so I just moved
right.
it forward. But we can certainly
These are
change
townhomes.
that.
These are just
Yeah.
townhomes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I will make that change, assuming I see all these heads nodding.
All right, so you can do townhomes up to 8 units. You can do multifamily up to 12 units, whether townhomes or condos or apartments, if you do mixed use. Then you can do all of the above up to 24 units if you also set aside affordable housing above the 12 units in a 1-to-4 ratio, or a fee in lieu,
Yes.
commensurate therewith, for purposes of parks, traffic,
However
or
you-
affordable housing.
You're basically rolling that same language forward, yes.
Good job. Feeling pretty good about that.
I do want a clarification on the standalone.
Yeah.
I understand a standalone, a townhouse has a common wall,
Yeah.
but you could have multiple connected townhouses.
Yeah.
I think you need to leave the flexibility to the developer.
4 in one part of the parcel and 4 in another part of the parcel?
Two.
Yeah,
I mean,
right,
as long
right.
as you got, I just want to make sure that by changing standalone or by having it, we aren't saying they all have to be connected.
No. I
Okay.
think you're fine.
Thank you.
change that development standard of the definition of a townhome.
No, it should be fine.
So are we comfortable with the motion, which has been seconded by Commissioner McDonald, I think? Is that right?
I have a,
Or do we need to paraphrase again? Go ahead.
it's not too late to, and I know I've asked this before, and I apologize for not remembering the answer. There are 3 adjoining developments to this neighborhood business zone. One further to the south, which is multifamily, and I think we said that was R18.
Right,
Larry, pull the zoning map.
I don't have.
You had the map on you.
Oh, yeah. Very good point. Okay, as Debbie reminds me, the map is on my PowerPoint, so let me pull it up.
And the reason I'm going into this is just to,
Now, can we see this? That's the question. Let's see if we can increase it here.
There you go.
So, whoops. Oh, darn it. Sorry about that. Where's my little... All right, so it looks like some is R12, the orange, and some is R18. And so if you look at the north end inside the circle, I think it's orange, and then to the east it's orange, to the south it's red. So some is R12, some is R18.
so my question, perhaps to the group, is we're inserting a zone here with really no greater density than what exists in the surrounding parcels or developments. To the south, we've got, I believe, R18 with the condominiums. To the east, we've got R12 with the the low-rise apartment units.
Right.
And to sort of the northeast, there are some, I think, 6-unit townhomes.
So you're suggesting...
Well, I'm just trying to rationalize
Right.
these numbers
So-
to what's already in the adjoining
right.
parcels. And if our goal in defining any type of neighborhood business zone is to encourage small business and, to some degree, density,
I think we're good.
are we achieving that if we're not even bringing it up to the standard of adjoining parcels? Or does that not matter?
So the staff recommendation was to have a higher density. It was to go actually to R18. But now that we're talking about the affordability issue, we were starting with the base of 8 to provide the opportunity to go to a higher level. Actually, the staff recommendation was 18, and you could go to 24 with this other affordability section. So we're trying to meld 2 different things. Staff's initial recommendation was based on the fact that we wanted to make the densities comparable to the surrounding development, which would lead to R18 or R24. So I think what you're proposing is that actually, are you interested in increasing the densities even higher in this area? And staff was not proposing an increased density in this area because it's not as close to downtown, not as good a transit service, et cetera.
So my first goal was just to identify that we have some higher density parcels adjoining this very zone that we're discussing. And to me, that almost seems a little counterintuitive to be anything less than what the adjoining. One fear, I guess, I have is that if the developers determine, they do the math and say, R8, I love it. I can put 8 $1 million townhomes here, and that's the maximum return on that property, versus 24 leasable units, only 3 of which at that math, by the way, right, in 1 and 4, only 3 of those would be affordable. It may work out better to put 8 standalone townhomes there than it would to put 24 mixed use with some affordable units.
Well, and I'll tell you, with my experience, that's likely to happen. Mixed use is very disfavored unless you're in a really high-density area, like Capitol Hill or... Aurora. Well, I'll give you, the best example is Lake City near 145th. That's a mixed-use project. That big apartment building at that or near that corner, they haven't filled those bottom floors. The reason they built it at all is because there was enough money in the residential side to offset the loss from not even leasing the bottom floor. So to have it, I mean, I agree that mixed use is something we really want. So I agree with all the intentions behind this motion. But thanks for bringing that up, because I think the likelihood is by making that a prerequisite to increase density on residential, it ain't going to happen.
Right. Just because of where it's located.
Well, yeah, I guess everything in real estate is about where it's located. But it's not just not located. It's not just because it's in this portion of Juanita. I don't think there's anywhere in Kenmore they're going to build mixed use. There maybe along if it ain't there now, there's not a huge chance it's going to happen, particularly because there's all these other denser areas in the region that aren't attracting mixed use. Go ahead, Mike.
I absolutely agree with both your comments, and we have people recall we did discuss this originally, and we said that mixed use just wasn't going to happen. But because we were talking about neighborhood business, we figured we needed to do something there that allowed business, whether that was retail, whether that was office, whether it was something else. I still believe that the reality is that that's not going to happen, and I think the preference would be for a strictly residential zone there. I think that's what's likely to be built there. But if it's, I guess there's a question: is it a consensus still of the commission that we need to allow incentive in there for mixed use for business? If we are, then I think the numbers are right that we've got in there.
Here's I think how it's likely to play out. I mean, I think what you're proposing is we just increase residential density without a mixed-use requirement if you really want to see it happening. And maybe you have, I think the consensus or the vast majority of commissioners wants an affordability element on top of that. I understand that. The risk of that is, and this is what the city manager brought up when we talked about the rezone along 522, when we first talked about how mixed use isn't happening, is that you lose a potential business area because the economic incentives are so great to build solely residential. And then it's all whatever residential form it takes, townhomes, condos, apartments. And the businesses are gone, not because they got pushed out, because they got so much money put on the table that it was too attractive for them to say no, but then there's no more business there. Then we've, now just it's a little over-residential perhaps than what we really like for the city. So either way, it either doesn't happen because we have an unacceptable mixed-use demand, or it happens in a way that eliminates the preferred use of this area as a business, a small business area.
But again, we're reviewing a neighborhood business zone that we got from King County, and back in those days, I mean, that was kind of the outpost of Kenmore, you know, and they were, King County was just saying that is what is there. But really, when you think about it, the commercial zone nearest that intersection is QFC, which is in Kirkland. And, you know, back in the day when I was a kid, that was a gravel field. You know, now it's the commercial zone. Whereas you go down to 153rd, and to develop that into commercial doesn't make sense, even though that's what it's zoned from King County from the 90s.
Well, that is a really interesting question. Does it make sense to let it just go to residential?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to have some incentive there
To
allow for commercial business. It'll either remain what it is, but when you think about what we're proposing, will it actually have the intended effect? Or is it?
I think we're starting to agree it won't.
It
because
won't.
of what we've seen, the pattern has already played itself out. We have evidence right near us of how it'll play out. Nothing will happen.
And
If you
so,
put a mixed-use requirement.
you know, so then even though it has a lot more traffic than it did even 5 years ago because of the bridge dealy-bob,
Oh, yeah.
the 520 bridge created a lot more traffic on Juanita than we had 5 years ago. There's lots of traffic going by there, but are they going to stop there?
Well, the neighborhood business, the purpose wasn't to serve who might stop going through. It's to serve the neighborhoods
surrounding-
around it.
Yeah. You know, so we can't really imagine what those potential mixed-use businesses might be, but to eliminate the potential of a builder doing it doesn't make sense to me either, just to make it all residential, because then you do take that incentive away forever.
So I might just interject here. So you're really talking about two different issues.
You are.
One issue is the fact that you have preliminarily decided that multifamily is an appropriate use in the zone, and that it can be either in mixed use or it can be a townhome. So that's one question. If you think that having the ability to do townhomes is not what you want there because you don't want a conversion to exclusively residential, that should be changed so that you could only do residential if you put it in mixed use. So that's one approach. The other question is the incentive to do mixed use. So you would retain the ability to do townhomes, but you would provide an increased density, an incentive to do mixed use, which is the proposal that is on the table right now. So you're kind of talking about two different questions.
What is the ratio of in mixed use between the office versus residential? Do we have a base ratio?
I think in that zone, I'd have to look back. We increased the ratio from 50% residential to 75% residential in the north area. That's a community business standard, and there may be a similar ratio for the south. It's either that same ratio or there's no ratio requirement. And you can do mixed use in Kenmore. It doesn't have to be in the same building. It can just be in a coordinated development. So you could do commercial on one portion of the site and residential on another portion of the site.
That's rare.
Yeah, it is.
It's almost always the ground floor is business and the upper levels are residential. That's probably economically.
Because otherwise you're wasting a lot of airspace.
Yeah, that's a good point. Go ahead, Commissioner McDonald.
This is a very interesting discussion, and I think we need to reflect on it more before we vote on it, in my opinion, because I think we wanted to have some small businesses in the south zone and talked about getting your car repaired and going up to the Speedy Mart to get the milk and so forth, and otherwise we got to go up to the QFC. And by the way, it was an airport.
An airport?
It was an airport initially. That property, they flew in planes on there.
Before my time.
Yes. So it was before my time too, but I just knew that from the history. But you know, that property in the south zone, it was always there was a store there when I was a 5-year-old kid, okay, and then it moved back to where the repair shop is, and then now it moved, so it's the store, the neighborhood store moved 3 times, or 2 times from its original spot. So, I mean, I think that's what we want. We want to have a little store we can run up and get, you know.
It could be a lot of things, but they're just convenient for people who live
Convenient,
nearby.
it's convenience. And now we're driving farther away to get stuff, and you know, I just think it's
Well,
Mike
here's what I
had a great observation, and it's
turn the
something-
whole thing on its head, and I think I'm so glad he did. But you know, it's 9:10 p.m. We've now got a whole different perspective on this area, and I agree with Commissioner McDonald that we need to think about this a little more than the few minutes we have left tonight, because this is a whole different paradigm I think we're working with, and it's a very healthy one, because it's realistic about how this is, you know, these changes are going to play out. So I propose that we just take it up at the next meeting.
So do you want to table the motion then, and then meet next week? And if you want to meet next week, is it a question that you just want to reflect, or is there specific questions or information that you want staff to bring back, recognizing that we only have between now and next week for your next meeting?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I think there are some questions. You know, it's even hard to know exactly what the questions are, but I think we can all sense that there are what the concerns are. I don't know if what answers they might require, and I invite anybody to ask the questions they might have. But I think it's really about how do we create incentives for builders to increase density residential in that area, but still preserve the likelihood that businesses will remain, or that businesses have to remain. You know, one thing that I was thinking of, and again, this is for next time to even really flesh into, because I'm just, thanks to Mike Mulcair, I'm still kind of noodling how this all is likely to play out. But if you had a very high incentive for mixed use, that might be the best way to get both. And maybe you go up to 24 without affordability requirements. In deference to all the concerns, I'm not doing that to kill affordability, but I think you may have to give that up if you're going to increase the likelihood of having small business at the bottom level of the new structures that might go there, and really prime the pump on the value of it. What you might end up with, I think I don't know if it's likely, but you might end up with what they have on Lake City, where somebody says, you know what, it's worth it to not lease up these spaces right away at the bottom floor, to build up to 24 units in this area. There's enough profit there, I'm willing to do that. And I don't have these extra affordability requirements to comply with. And yeah, they may be vacant for a few years, but someday they'll probably fill up. Anyway, that's just for down the road. I'm sure that somebody else will have another idea or 3 that we can kick around next time. But I think that's at the root of it. And if the staff, have things that you think might shed light on those concerns, because I think those are what they are. Is that right? Fair to say? That we could take that up at the next meeting.
And if just so I leave here with the right information in my head, the current zoning for the south zone is 8, R8?
Correct.
We would have to do the next meeting next week because I'm out of town. No, I'm not. Now we can do it.
August 1st is your regular.
Okay.
meeting, so that would be next Tuesday.
That would work for me at least.
Okay. So North Zone, it sounds like we have the recommendation, and
Have
next,
A motion that's been approved and
right,
adopted.
exactly. And then next week, we'll take up the South Zone, and I think I heard, or I saw a nodding of heads, that other issues seem to be resolved and you're comfortable with them after
Is that right?
tonight.
The other rezones, that proposed, the staff
The other
proposals.
changes to development standards and that kind of thing. Okay.
And can you give us some feedback on what your ideas are on the South Zone?
Yeah, I will.
Great. All right. Anything else? All right, that satisfies the neighborhood business zone review. Item of the agenda, is there any new business? I know it's late, I'm not expecting it, but I have to ask that. There being none, this meeting is hereby adjourned.
Messed it up for everybody.